Hi, I'm Timothy Fricker. I'm presenting this video because it's clear to me as a litigator for many years, a litigator litigating predominantly in family law courts, that many people come to the courts, many of my clients come to these courtroom hearings with a great deal of fear and trepidation about what's happening. And I've been very, very fortunate in finding a tool that would actually help me in dealing with my fears, and that's what I want to share with you today. The video, although the video is designed initially for my clients in litigation, obviously this can apply to anyone who wants to deal with the existential fears and resentments that we all seem to have, whether it's litigation or not litigation. A couple of things that I want to point out when I refer to this process. I'm going to be referring to it as collectively as the steps. Now you might wonder where I get that term from. Well, I was showing this process and I have adopted this process as a result of my own experience within a 12-step program. And what in fact I am about to explain to you is my version of steps 10 and 11 within the 12-step program. Now I cannot tell you what program it is because of concerns about anonymity, and also because there are traditions within the 12-step program that preclude me from doing that. But I would like to say that it's my personal experience, and as a result of this personal experience, I found I've been given really a very, very powerful tool to deal with my own fears and resentments, and of course now I'd like to share it with you. A couple of caveats, of course, being an attorney, that's inevitable, right? First of all, you must understand that I'm certainly not preaching any religious view here. This is just my experience with these steps. I'm certainly not claiming to be a therapist or a psychiatrist or anything like that. And this is certainly not legal advice. This is just sharing with you and anyone else who cares to know about it, about my experiences with the with these steps, and how it has helped me over the years deal with my fears and resentments. A couple of other things that I need to mention is that, first of all, based on my experience, this is a very, very powerful tool. So in many respects, this isn't for the meek or the mild. This is probably going to bring up a lot of stuff that you might not want to bring up, and so you've got to be prepared for that. Also, if you ever have problems in doing these steps, if it's ever too much for you, the simple answer is stop doing them. The other thing that I think is also very important is I'll be explaining to you how I've been shown how to do these steps. And this might seem somewhat possibly grandiose or perhaps sort of dictatorial in a way, but what I suggest you do is you do them exactly the way I suggest you do them. If you do Tom's version or Sue's version or Mohammed's version, or whatever version you want to do, then you're not going to be having the same experience as me, because you're not doing exactly what I do. So do your own version, whatever you want, but unless you do exactly what I suggest, you're not going to have the same experience. The other thing that is very, very important about these steps is that based on my experience, I don't think anyone really is going to do what I suggest or what I'm going to put forth here, unless they're kind of desperate, put it frankly. So I believe that the only way that these steps can be effective is if you who are watching this and obviously considering the process are in a position in your life where you've tried everything else and it don't work. You must really be in a situation where you've become hopeless in many ways about your ability or any help that you might have from outside sources, the combination of the two, any hope of that modality, that system that you're now using, of actually working. In other words, the only real the only way that the steps, in my opinion and my experience, are going to be effective is if you've given up on everything else. You need to be, relatively speaking, hopeless that anything you do will affect any sort of relief as to your fears and resentments. Otherwise, this process will never work for you. Now, the process itself is actually relatively simple. It involves two steps, really. The first step is a process of simply writing out all your fears and also your anger, that I'll be referring to as resentments, on a piece of paper. The reason the two are connected is because a resentment or an anger is always, without fail, premised on a fear. So what you're going to be doing is actually writing out a simple program, a simple system, all your fears and all your resentments and all the fears that those resentments are based on a piece of paper, and essentially see what happens. The second step is going to involve meditation, and I'll be talking about that later. But again, I want to reiterate, and I'm probably going to do this several times until you're sick of it, that I suggest very, very strongly that you do exactly what I do. Otherwise, you're not going to have the same experience as me. I think it's important that before we start discussing exactly what to do, the exact process of surrendering all these fears and resentments, that you understand exactly what I mean by fear. I don't mean that that in any way we are cowardly or frightened or in any way weak, really. I mean fear as it is in the form of an acronym. And what I mean by that is that the false existence, or to use the legal term, the false evidence appearing real. In other words, the fears that we surrender are really delusions that we have about what is coming down the pipeline, and we all know that's very, very bad, right? And that we're convinced is going to happen to us, or convinced is actually happening to us now. These fears are always based on the wreckage of our past, and we're confronted with situations, for example, difficult litigation, that brings up all these fears, and of course we adopt it in the present and we project it into the future. But the fears are delusions. They're the delusions that this is going to happen, and that's going to happen, and this is what's going to happen, and that's what's going to happen. Now, in some respect, we might even know sort of intellectually that yes, these fears are delusions, and quite frankly, how do I know they're going to happen? But with many of us, that sort of intellectual understanding is completely irrelevant. What happens is we get so fearful about what's going to happen that it comes upon us, and it is so intense and so uncomfortable that we need relief at all costs, which, by the way, is why you're watching this video. So the impending doom that we manifest in our head is the false expectations appearing real, the false experience appearing real, or the false evidence appearing real, which we are convinced is going to happen. So that's what I mean by fear. It's not a criticism of our characters. It's not to say that we are cowardly or scaredy cats or anything like that. It's just that what happens is, based on the wreckage of our past, present circumstances trigger all this wreckage, and we project it all out into the future. And quite frankly, there's no stopping it, unless, of course, these steps that I'm about to describe are effective in the way they've been effective with me, and I hope that they're effective with you. So what do we actually do? Well, we need a pen and we need a piece of paper. The reason we need a pen and a piece of paper is that we're going to organically surrender all these fears and resentments on a piece of paper to see whether or not they will be temporarily removed, and some, after a while, permanently removed. And that will determine on whether or not they are actually delusions or not. Because if it's not false evidence appearing real, if it's not complete and utter delusion, or put it another way, complete and utter insanity, then they won't be removed. But I suspect that you will find that as you surrender all these fears that you have about litigation or about whatever it is, I suspect you will have the experience where these fears are temporarily removed, sometimes for a short period, sometimes for a long period, and some of them will be permanently removed if you write about them enough. So, you get your piece of paper and you get your pen, and organically you language out, you write out what these fears are. And it's organically because it's from the brain, through the neck, through the shoulder, through the arm, through the hand and the fingers, through the pen or the pencil and onto the piece of paper. And you write out, I have fear, and whatever it is. Now, it's very important that it's done organically like this, with a piece of paper and a pen, because if you use a word processor or a computer of some type, you're bound to censor yourself and you're bound to edit yourself, and it mustn't be like that. It must be a stream of consciousness wherein you surrender as much of your fear that you have at that time. Now, my experience sometimes has 1 or 2 lines, or sometimes a short paragraph. But my experience is also that sometimes it's an all-night session with an ocean of tears, and usually it's somewhere in between. So, out with the pen and paper, and what we write out is, I have fear. I'll give you some examples. I have fear that the judge is going to rule against me. Fear the judge doesn't like me. Fear I'm going to lose everything. Fear the kids are going to be taken from me. All the intense fears that are bothering us at the time that they're bothering us. Now notice that in the explanation, the first sentence is, I have fear, whatever it is. I have fear the judge doesn't like me. And all subsequent sentences, you don't really need the I have, because it's almost grammatically, redundant. So the first sentence is, I have fear, whatever it is, and the second sentence and all subsequent sentences, you don't need the I have. Just write fear this, fear that. And as I said before, it needs to be a stream of consciousness, because one fear that you reveal and is put down on a piece of paper is almost certainly covering a fear underneath. So you write down exactly what comes to mind, exactly what's in your head, until you run out of fears to write about. Now, the other thing that I mentioned was resentments or anger, but I refer to them as resentments. And what you need to understand, which I've said before, is that resentment is always premised, based upon our fear. So how do we deal with that? Well, it's a very similar process. You write out, for example, I'm resentful at my ex because I have fear that she's going to take my money. I'm resentful at my husband because I have fear he's going to take the kids from me. In other words, the resentment is always connected to our own fears. So it's not really the anger and the resentment that's the problem, although it feels like the problem. It feels painful and it feels like it's burning through us. It's not really the problem. The problem is us. And the problem is our own self-centered fears upon which these resentments are always premised. So the process of surrendering all the fears and the resentment, which really means the fears and resentments that are based on a fear, is a simple one, although in my experience very difficult to do. So I'll reiterate what you have to do. You need a pen and you need a paper. And in a form of stream of consciousness, you need to write out on the piece of paper, starting at the top of the paper, until your hand falls off or you run out of things to say. Sometimes just a few lines, sometimes pages and pages and pages and oceans of tears. And it's simple. I have fear, I'm running out of money. Fear, the boss looked at me funny yesterday. Fear, she's having an affair. Fear he's having an affair, etc., etc., etc. Or I'm resentful of the judge because I have fear the judge doesn't like me. I'm resentful at my attorney because I have fear he's not doing a good job. Whatever the fears and resentments are, they must be surrendered. And you must understand that it's always based on a fear. Always, 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 without exception. So when we finished writing out all these fears and resentments, and there's nothing really left in the mind at the moment, we need to sign off properly. And the way we sign off is we say, "Thank you for revealing and removing these fears. I ask only for knowledge of your will for us and the power to carry that out. Love, Tim," or whatever your name is. Now, it's important to sign off in this manner because, as I said to you earlier, one of the, if you like, preconditions of doing these steps is that we must realize that it's impossible for us, based on our own self-will, to have these fears and resentments removed. It's just impossible. We've tried everything we can and it doesn't work. Therefore, what we're relying on is some sort of power that exists outside of ourselves to do the work for us. Some people would call that God. Some people would call it the creative power of the universe. Some people would call it the divine goddess, or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't really matter. But the point is that we're seeking some sort of outside supernatural force, really, I guess, of what it is, to help us have these fears removed from our consciousness, so that we can live a life that's a little bit happier, right? So I know that this all sounds weird, but this is the reason why, as I just said, as I stated earlier, that there has to be that idea in our heads that we've tried everything and it doesn't work, so we might as well try this and see what happens. So that's what we're doing, is we're thanking this creative power of the universe for acting on our behalf and having these fears and resentments removed from us temporarily and ultimately permanently, and also relying on this power that we don't really believe in, let's face it, to reveal to us that these fears that we have are not real, that they are delusion, and that they are false evidence appearing real. So that's what we do to sign off. And when you've done that, you just see what happens. Now, I've given you a lot of information in this video, a lot of instructions about exactly what to do. As I've said ad nauseum now, right? What I suggest you do is do exactly what I said and follow the directions as I've suggested. Otherwise, you won't be having the same experience that I've had. Anyway, don't worry if you didn't get everything, because I'm going to, in the notations below the video, I'm going to explain in perhaps a lot more simple terms than I have now, the directions as to what I suggest you do to have this experience. This is ultimately about relief. It's nothing to do with your belief systems about the efficacy of these steps, or the existence or the non-existence of a God or a supernatural being. It's got nothing to do with that. It's a simple process of surrendering your fears and see what happens. Either it's going to be effective for you or it's not. And I suspect that there are going to be some people who will have a very powerful and very positive experience with this, and there might be some people that it doesn't affect at all. So it's up to you if you want to continue it. I urge you to continue doing this if it has any effect at all. If it doesn't, stop doing it. And put your seatbelt on, because you're going to need it. We now have to talk about meditation, which, as I said earlier, was the 11th step of the 12-step program that I've been experiencing. And the 11th step is about getting further relief from the sort of existential angst that we all fear live in our day-to-day lives, especially when confronted with difficult situations, for example, like litigation. Now, my experience is that for many years I was practicing a type of meditation that required me to use my self-will in order to try and be free of my self-will. For many years I used a passage meditation where I would repeat spiritual passages in my mind, and I found the effects to be quite limited and very, very temporary, if at all. And I think the problem was for me is that, as I said, I was required to use my self-will in order to somehow dissipate and be free of my self-will. And the process for me was very ineffective. The meditation system that I use now, and which is the one I strongly urge you to do for reasons I've said before many times already, is Vedic meditation, or sometimes it's referred to as transcendental meditation. And the reason I suggest this very, very strongly is because, based on my experience and my understanding of other meditation techniques, this is the only meditation that it does not involve the self-will. In other words, all other types of meditation assume that the natural state of the brain is to be cluttered and busy and like a mouse running around on a treadmill, or as some people call it, monkeys in a tree, or the boardroom, continuously creating chatter and dissonance. The Vedic meditation, the transcendental meditation, assumes otherwise. It assumes and has the experience of actually the brain's natural condition is to be quiet. And so it uses a system of a mantra that charms you into this natural quietness in a natural and hands-off approach. So it's the only meditation that I've ever found that does not involve the self-will in quieting the self-will. All other meditations that I'm aware of do that. And that approach would be antithetical, in my experience, to the principles of these steps, because, as you might have begun to understand, that when we surrender our fears and our resentments, what we're really surrendering is our self-will, because that's what our self-will is dominated by. It's dominated by fear and resentment. So to comport with that process of surrendering the self-will, we need a meditation technique that is also surrendering the self-will. And the process involved in Vedic or transcendental meditation comports with that, because it doesn't involve the self-will trying to shut down the self-will. So to really reiterate what I've said before, and I'm sorry if you're sick of hearing this, but like I said, I strongly urge you to use Vedic meditation, or sometimes transcendental meditation is a type of Vedic meditation, to use this approach because, based on my experience, it's the only one that comports with the rest of the steps. So I urge you to do that, and what you will find is that the transcendental meditation will take the edge off this process of surrendering the fears and resentment. Because, as you might remember, when I first started talking about these steps, my experience is that it's very powerful, and it's a profound experience, and I guess almost by definition, it's going to bring up a lot of the baggage and a lot of the wreckage from your past, which you might not want to deal with. So my experience is that the transcendental meditation takes the edge off and gives us some peace and some release in between the written inventory, and in conjunction with the written inventory, I find the two processes to be profoundly effective and very, very relieving. Ultimately, what this video is all about you getting relief, and also me getting relief, about us getting relief from the existential angst of living, and the way the existential angst manifests itself is through fear and resentment. So, as I said, I put all the directions below in the commentary section of the video. Look at that if you need it for reference. But the whole process is quite simple. I suggest you do this twice daily and as much as you need in between. You write out your fears and you write out your resentments that are always premised on a fear, and you follow the directions as to how to do that. Once you've done that and you run out of ammunition, or your head's fallen off, or something's fallen off, then you follow that by at least 20 minutes, or as much as you can, of Vedic meditation or transcendental meditation. I believe they're very, very similar. And then you see what happens.